I'm in Portsmouth today. It's Britain's only island city, home to about 210,000 people. It's on the south coast of England. It's famous for its Royal Navy base. It's over there somewhere. Important transport link for people going places. It's the birthplace of Charles Dickens. It's in trouble though because it was built on a sea level marsh. This is a problem because sea levels are rising due to climate change. There's so much heat energy in the oceans. The ice caps are melting so quickly, the oceans will rise for centuries to come. There's nothing we can do about it. Even if we got to zero carbon tomorrow, it's too late. There's too much heat energy in the oceans. Portsmouth, Miami, New York, London, Amsterdam are all going to be lost to the sea. There's nothing we can do about it. Beyond the year 2100, global mean sea level will continue to rise for centuries due to continuing deep ocean heat uptake and mass loss of Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets, and will remain elevated for thousands of years. High confidence. You don't often hear the scientists say that, do you? High confidence. So, in this video, I'm going to walk along the seafront at Portsmouth and South Sea. And I'm going to do that because Portsmouth City Council are spending £180 million to improve the sea defences, which it hopes will give the city another 100 years. This is old Portsmouth. It looks like something out of Pirates of the Caribbean. As of everything to do with climate change, it's happening more quickly than people anticipated. Officially, the last United Nations report, they thought sea levels could rise by between 0.6 metres and 1 metre by the year 2100. The trouble is, though, that ice sheets are losing so much more ice than people anticipated, and the rate of ice loss is increasing. Plus, the sea levels are increasing more quickly than people expected. It looks as though the sea level rise could be almost exponential. Hence, global sea level might rise well above the likely range before the year 2100, which is reflected by assessments of ice sheet contributions based on structured expert judgment, leading to a 95th percentile of projected future sea level rise as high as 2.3 metres in the year 2100. Portsmouth City Council thinks it can cope with sea level rise by being able to cope with 1.1 metre of sea level rise by the year 2100. United Nations says it could be 2.3 metres as a 5% chance of 2.3 metres or above. A plausible storyline for such high-end sea level rise in 2100 assumes a strong warming scenario. The storyline considers faster than projected disintegration of marine ice shelves and the abrupt widespread onset of marine ice cliff instability and faster than projected changes in both the surface and mass balance and dynamical ice loss in Greenland. If it's your job to build the coastal defences of Portsmouth, the United Nations wants you to be even more cautious. Stakeholders with a low risk tolerance, e.g. those planning for coastal safety in cities and long-term investment in critical infrastructure, may wish to consider global mean sea level rise above the assessed likely range. Certainly above 1 metre, possibly 2 metres. The trouble is, we don't really know what the speed is going to happen at. Because of our limited understanding of the rate at which some of the governing processes contribute to long-term sea level rise, we cannot currently robustly quantify the likelihood with which they can cause higher level sea rise before the year 2100. Sea level rise is definitely going to happen. Portsmouth is definitely going to be lost. They just don't know when. In doing so, we note up front the main uncertainty related to high-end sea level rise is when, rather than if, it arises. This is Portsmouth, the mouth of the port, and this square is where, if anyone knows about naval history knows, in the old days you used to put a chain across the entrance to the harbours. This is the square where one end of the chain used to arrive. And there's a tower up there as well, so we should keep going on our talk. When it said there, ice cliff instability might lead to higher sea levels, do you know how much of a difference that might make? Here's the diagram that says, by the year 2100, if we carry on as we are, we shall have between 0.6 and 1 metre sea level rise by the year 2100. But the United Nations also gives you an estimate for the year 2,300. And that could be anywhere between 4 metres and 16 metres of sea level rise by the year 2300. And if you look at this diagram, that really steep line is what happens if the ice sheets collapse, which, according to the United Nations, it is possible. You might think to yourself, well, 2300, it seems a long time, do we need to worry about it? By the year 2050, 1/4 of all the houses in Britain will be at risk of flooding from time to time. And by the year 2060, 1,000 million people around the world will live in low-lying coastal areas, which means they'll be at less than 10 metres above sea level, which might sound quite high, but as we'll see later on, that's quite serious. So this is old Portsmouth, this is the old walls. Ideal places to put in cannons. It's about, I think now, let me have a look to see where we are on the tides. So for today, high tide was at 20 past 6 this morning. Low tide is at 12:38, which is about in 40 minutes time. And high tide again will be 8 o'clock this evening. So this is low tide, and it is 2 metres above the absolute minimum low tide that they expected to get to. This might be a good time to explain how heights are calculated in Britain, because that will be an important part later on in the video. The gold standard for calculating heights in Britain above sea level is carried out by the Ordnance Survey people. They do all the maps, they do all the official measurements all government bodies use. And they say all heights are measured from the lowest low tide in your particular area. If you use Google Earth, they use a different measure. They use mean sea level, so they use sort of halfway between high tide and low tide. One of the lowest tides, or one of the most extreme tides I saw in my tide book for Portsmouth, said on the 28th of March, low tide was 0.4 metres above absolute minimum sea level, and high tide was 4.65 metres above minimum sea level. You might be thinking to yourself, if height above sea level is measured from the lowest low tide, how is it the lowest low tide, count everything confined, in this tide book, is 0.4 metres? It's because sea levels are already rising. They've risen already by 0.25 metres. It varies around the world, so it seems in Portsmouth they've already had 0.4 metres of sea level rise. And a high tide of 4.6 metres above minimum sea level means that large parts of Portsmouth are already below sea level at high tide. Since making the video, I found a case where Portsmouth does have a 0.25 metre low tide, so it's right in line with the global average sea level rise. A 0.25 metre rise makes having only a 0.6 metre rise by the year 2100 sound a bit hopeful. And of course, the tides vary depending on the relative locations of the moon and the sun. Here's an Ordnance Survey map. It lists very conscientiously all of the heights around the city. Most of Portsmouth is below 5 metres above sea level, which is 5 metres above the lowest tide. Well, high tide is 4.65 metres, so a lot of Portsmouth is already below sea level now. And in 100 years' time, it's quite likely to be another metre below sea level. This is the first section of new seawall. Hold it over the side so you can see. All the way along the road, all this next 2 miles, the walls are gradually going up between about 0.6 or 0.8 metres. You can tell it's new. They're sort of warning you not to go down to the beach anymore, although there is someone there walking a dog. To give Portsmouth City Council their due, they do have a good understanding of the science. I know in these things normally you end up complaining about how little governments know or how much they admit to, but they do a good job. They know the predicted level of sea level rise. They know it could be 2 metres by the year 2100. They know their options are limited. The British government won't let them plan for 2 metres. They have to stick to a 1.1 metre rise, I think. They know their efforts might not be enough. The extreme sea level rise in the scenario results from faster melting of the ice sheets. Scenario is intended to provide an extreme but physically plausible range for users wishing to investigate contingency planning. They know the city will experience extreme sea levels more often, that storms will cause extreme water levels 20 times more often than before. There'll be more variability in weather events, greater intensity of rainfall in shorter time frames, greater wind variability in speed and strength, and Portsmouth will be at more risk of flooding of all types. You might be asking yourself, if the City Council knows a 2 metre sea level rise is quite possible by the year 2100, if the United Nations says if you're planning sea defences you should be more cautious and cope with more than 1 metre sea level rise, why are they sticking to 1 metre sea level rise? Partly because that's the guidelines from the central government in Britain. Also, if you look at that chart that shows the forecasted sea level rise by the year 2300, if by the year 2100 we've had 2 metres of sea level rise, that means we're on the trajectory of sea level rise caused by the ice cliffs, or the ice sheets, collapsing. If we're at 2 metres of sea level rise by 2100, by the year 2150, just 50 years later, we'll be on that trajectory. We'll be at something like 6 metres of sea level rise. It's just you can't cope with such steep levels of sea rise. So they can cope with 1 metre. If the ice cliffs, the marine ice cliffs collapse, you can't cope with that at all. Not Portsmouth, not New York, not London. Also, in 100 years' time, the world will be a different place. If we carry on as you are climate change, there'll be large parts of the earth no longer habitable to humans, which is where they live now. Food production will be steeply in decline. It will just be a completely different world. It's quite possible in 100 years' time, whether Portsmouth's underwater or not is the least of our worries, even for the people of Portsmouth. You might think that the ice cliffs along the ice sheets might not collapse, but whatever causes the increase in sea level rise by the year 2100 is going to carry on causing it to rise at just the same rate. Look at the chart again. There's no line that sort of gets to the year 2100 and like calms down or levels off or even goes down. Whatever the rate of sea level rise by the year 2100 or even 2050, all the scientists seem to agree it will carry on at the same rate or even speed up, which means Portsmouth can cope with a 1 metre sea level rise, but not a 2 metre one. Now we're just coming into the tourist area. This is where we used to come as a family when I was a little boy, drive down, spend a day at the seaside. If you're thinking it's a bit run down, it was just as run down when I came. This was all part of the fun. And for a small boy, the most exciting thing about coming to the seaside 45, 50 years ago was going into the amusement arcades. Computers had just been invented. It was very exciting. It brings back so many happy memories coming here. They're still building the next section. It's going to take them 2 years to build a 0.6 kilometre stretch along the coast and to raise up the land by 0.8 of a metre. The thing that's striking is how little it affects the area. Come back in 2 years' time, and apart from a wider, nicer promenade, I don't think you'd notice a difference. It's not just something to stop the sea, but it's a genuine effort to make an enjoyable, usable space for people who've come to the seaside. Also, there's a great effort to try and win public support. The hoardings are covered in explanations of what's happening and why the work is needed. There are beautiful videos with clear explanations of what's going on and why it's needed.
Some of you have asked, why do we need to replace and upgrade the sea defences? Well, our current ones are reaching the end of their lifespan. If we want to help protect South Sea for the next century, then we must take into account the effects of climate change.
But why is it costing so much money, and why is it taking so long? If you wanted to raise your seawall by a metre, well, here's a 1 metre seawall. It's part of the original 100-year-old existing defences. It's been here 100 years, doing its job. Why? Why have we got so many boulders? Why is the embankment so solid? Why don't they just build another 1 metre tall seawall or a higher seawall? We're going to find that out later on in the video. This is the third section they've done. This is all finished. What's curious though is how the people of Portsmouth just carry on as normal. Whenever you buy a house in Britain, you have to have a survey done and a report produced for the mortgage company. And in Portsmouth, being a sea level marsh surrounded by the sea, the reports come back warning them of the dangers of flooding, also of how high the groundwater is. In the areas of Portsmouth near to the coast, the groundwater goes up almost exactly the same rate as the tide, and it goes up as high as the tide. One person on social media reported they had a friend who had a new garage built for their house, and his friend liked working on cars, so he had an inspection pit dug in the garage so he could go underneath the cars. He said he could only work on his cars at low tide because at high tide the groundwater was so high it flooded the pit. So there's always going to be, and the Portsmouth City Council put this in the report, there's also always going to be a limited impact to what the coastal defences could do if the water can just seep in. But anyway, when you buy a house, they have these reports produced, and people say, I've had this very frightening report produced for a house in this part of Portsmouth. What do you think I should do? And people reply and say, I've lived here for 4 years, it's fine. And also, they go ahead because people say, yes, but the government's spending all this money on the coastal defences, and we can still get insurance for our houses. So, Portsmouth is carrying on, okay, because the people have trust in the government. Remember, as civilization carries on, providing there's a good relationship between the government and the people. They're very trusting in Britain, aren't they? We have good... People like to moan about their taxes and governments and things, but we do appreciate them when they do good things. But it's not just coastal flooding Portsmouth is at risk from. It's at risk for every type of flooding except from rivers. There doesn't have any major rivers in Portsmouth. So, for example, these days, if you built a new housing estate in Britain, you have to put in 2 completely separate sets of drains. One to drain the water from the houses. There's some nice steps here, I should point out. Make it a bit higher. Anyway, if you build a new housing estate in Britain, you need 2 sets of drains. One set of drains to drain the water away from houses when you flush the toilet and empty the bath. Plus you need a second, completely separate set of drains for the rainwater, the stormwater drains. Well, most of the houses in Portsmouth were built 100 years ago. There's one set of drains. When it rains, if there's a flood but there's too much rain, the drains that are going to spill over into the road are full of poo from the houses. In the future, the British government says by 2070 we should have 45% more rain. And they say if you're doing anything to 2100, then just use the 2070 figures. I don't know why, because probably in brackets underneath it says, because we shall all be dead by then, so let's not worry about it. It's a nice castle. And steps, you can sit there and admire the view. There's another castle out to sea. Plus, because the groundwater is so high, it seeps in, and the drains are so old, it seeps into the sewers, into the drains. And a high tide, remember, most of Portsmouth is at sea level at high tide. So, in cases of heavy rain, at a high tide, there's a great risk of flooding. There have been floods in the last, one flood in the last 20 years, I think. And people just said, we just need to clean out the gutters better, which is probably true. They just had to improve what they had. 45% increase by 2070. So they're spending 180 million pounds on the sea defences, part of which we're walking along now, plus 170 million pounds on improving the drainage. They're patching up the pipes near the coast to stop the groundwater soaking in. They've already had they have pumping stations already, because they suffer from what's called tide lock. The force of gravity isn't enough to empty the drains into the sea at high tide, so they actively have to pump it out. They're going to build a new pumping station that's underground. I'm not sure how underground pumping stations work. There's a flood, but still. The problem with Portsmouth, like the rest of the world, is it was not built for our future climate. So altogether, to protect 210,000 people, the government is spending £350 million. If you compare that, each year Britain is planning to spend £295 million for the whole of Britain to help people install air source heat pumps into their houses, which is less than what's being spent to help 210,000 people. I can't help noticing, if you're doing something that protects you from the impacts of climate change, protects your constituents who vote for you, well, every pound you spend of £180 million on sea defences, your constituents get 100% of that benefit. So that's called adaptation. If instead you spend the money on air source heat pumps to reduce CO2 emissions so we can have a survivable future, well, everyone in the whole world benefits. But your constituents only get a very small part of that benefit. Which probably explains why Portsmouth City Council, when it comes to adaptation, when it comes to directly protecting their constituents, they know what the science is, a very good understanding of the science. When it comes to mitigation, to reducing our CO2 emissions, possibly by asking your constituents to change their lifestyles, the government seems to know much less about climate science and have much less money to do that. Here's a bit. So here's the difference between the beach. The Shell beach is quite steep. You can see how steep it is, can't you? I shall go down there in a minute. So boulders on this part, beach on this part. When it comes to persuading your constituents to try and reduce their carbon footprints, that's a much more politically sensitive matter. Even here, if you see all the explanations about what's going on, all the good news story, they're still trying to win people over. Well, when it comes to dealing with rising sea levels, really you've got three choices of what you can do. It's quite nice here by the sea. You've got three choices of what you can do. You can advance, you can attack the sea, you advance into it, you build out. That's not really practical, that must be very expensive to do that. And you need lots of space in Portsmouth with all the shipping and everything, that wouldn't really be practical. Or you can retreat. You can abandon the land, you let the sea gradually take it over. For Portsmouth, you'd have to give up 10,000 homes, 700 businesses. You'd have to give up the motorway. Motorways are probably just as expensive to build as these sea defences are. Also, if you say you've got 10,000 houses to give up, you've got 20 to 30,000 people probably living in there. You have to move them all out. In other parts of the world where they've built new housing for people and moved them away from the coast. The number one problem is if you move 20, 30,000 people, you can't keep everyone happy. Some people are going to end up in worse houses. Some people aren't going to be able to get to work. If you look at this map that shows car ownership in Portsmouth, most people in Portsmouth don't own a car. So they're what you might say, they're immobile. They have a house, they walk to work or get there by public transport or cycle. If you think how politically sensitive it is changing the waterfront, how much care the local government is going to try and keep everyone happy. Britain isn't China. It's just politically very difficult to move 20 to 30,000 people. Plus, the homes could quite easily be livable for another 100 years. It's only extreme weather events will stop that. 100 years, 2 or 3 generations could be brought up there. 3 or 4 generations could be brought up in a house over 100 years. The trouble is, though, one day that process will have to happen. Some government in the future will have to negotiate with 20 to 30,000 people to move them. So I think that's the end of that work that's been carried out so far. But they're going to improve this part of the beach past the pier and all the way over to what's called Canoe Lake. This is going to still be beach, and I think they're just going to build up the path that runs along the top of the beach by, I think it's 0.6 of a metre or 0.8 of a metre. You can see already the road or the path along the beach, really about a metre higher than the land itself. So all this is probably have to come up another 0.8 or 0.6 metres.
If we don't do this work, the current defences will continue to deteriorate, and some areas of Southsea could see water depth up to 4 metres in the event of a major flood event.
We can say to ourselves, 1 metre sea level rise, is that really going to be a problem? But Portsmouth City Council believes there could be 4 metres of flooding in Portsmouth itself. It's not just sea level rise is going to affect us, but extreme weather events. Damage associated with sea level rise is mostly caused by extreme events such as storm surges. Of most concern is the coincidence of a storm surge with high tide levels leading to extreme sea levels. In Europe, the most intense surge events typically occur during winter events. Furthermore, the concurrence of high sea levels and heavy precipitation, 45% heavier by 2017, may cause compound flooding in low-lying coastal areas. A storm surge isn't what they show you on the television news when there's a storm and you see these great waves spilling over and the TV reporter stands there with an umbrella getting wet. That's wave overtopping, you can see. A storm surge is when, well, there's 2 things that affect it. First of all, wind constantly blowing across the sea surface towards land causes the water to build up against the land, so sea levels go up that way. In Portsmouth, when they have a big storm surge, it's about 1 metre, and on one occasion I saw that storm surge lasted for 10 days. just because of the constant, so it's like a constant increase in level, not just a spectacular big wave, although wave overtopping is a factor as well. The second thing that causes storm surges, or causes the sea level to rise in a storm, is at the centre of a storm there's a low pressure area, and that low pressure almost sort of sucks the water level up higher. If you live in a part of the world where sea temperatures are 26 degrees Celsius or above, then that's warm enough for hurricanes. Hurricanes have strong winds. There's an aeroplane up there. Hurricanes have strong winds and a low pressure in their centre. Most of the damage that will come from rising sea levels and increased storm surges will be in areas which are shown in sort of gold on this map. A lot of them are in the Far East. By 2050, the impacts of climate change and storm surges and the impacts of rising sea levels will turn what at one time was a once in 100-year storm into a once in a 10-year storm. The historically 1 in 100-year coastal floods are projected to increase by a factor of 10 before the year 2050 in many locations along the Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts, and along all remaining European coasts by the end of the century under low emission scenarios. Remember, we always underestimate the impacts of climate change, so I think it's a good idea to be interested in the higher range spectrum, which might seem less likely, but we'll see in the future. Anyway, under high emission scenario, 1 in 100-year coastal floods are expected to occur at least once a year along most European coasts before the year 2050, with some exception due to already available flood protection measures. Can you see now why Portsmouth City Council are so keen to build up their coastal defences? What was once a once in 100-year flood could be happening once every 10 years under low emission scenarios, could be happening every year. What makes it more interesting is we don't have a good understanding of storm surges or how likely they are to happen. Only a few studies have attempted to quantify the role of anthropogenic climate change in extreme sea level events. Large regional variations and limited observational data lead to low confidence in observed trends in the surge contribution to increasing extreme sea levels. For this video, if I wanted to know how much more it will rain, I could look that up on the government website, 45% by 2070. If I wanted to know how much sea levels would increase, I could look that up, between 0.6 and 1 metre, 1.1 metre in Portsmouth, the government thinks, possibly 2.3 metres. If you want to know the impacts of storm surges, it's much more difficult to work out. The government will not tell you, like a bland figure. Possibly 10% was one figure I saw, but if you're doing your coastal defences, the government will provide you with some data that you put into your model for your specific location, and then you're on your own. You have to try and work out. One of the reasons that storm surges are so difficult to predict is that the storms are caused by, or in Britain, they are caused by differences in temperature in the atmosphere and in the sea, in the Atlantic. They're caused by the impacts of the jet stream, and they're caused by other winds, which I've temporarily forgotten while walking on the beach. All of that is going to change. The temperatures in the Atlantic, the directions of the wind, just walk around this man with a fishing line. The power of the jet stream is slowing down, so it's meandering more. And it's the same for the rest of the world. El Nino, La Nina. They have big impacts all the way around the world. High up. Nobody knows what the weather patterns will be like in the future. And if they did, we haven't got the science to work out how they impact us now, let alone in 50 or 100 years' time. Apart from a few exceptions, such as Amsterdam, Rotterdam, most metropolitan areas high up in the rankings of being at risk from storm surges are exposed to tropical cyclones. At a global level, Tropical cyclones are clearly the main driver of storm surge risks. That being said, we should not underestimate the threat posed by atmospheric phenomena, such as winter storms in Europe. And then it gives you a list of all the countries at risk. 12 million people in the Pearl River Delta in China, 8.6 million Shanghai, 5.1 million Amsterdam, Rotterdam, 3.1 million Osaka, Kobe in Japan, and 2.7 million in Tokyo in Japan. Well, that's all very well in the future, but could you ever imagine 4 metres of flooding in Portsmouth? I think you'd need something like a 3-metre storm surge above the high tide. Well, you don't have to imagine what that would be like, because in 1953 in Britain and in the Netherlands there was a 3-metre storm surge. It's a famous storm, maybe a once in 100-year storm that we can look forward to more often. 1,800 people killed, tens of thousands of people had to be evacuated. People say that won't affect Portsmouth because that storm that caused the storm surge in 1953 was in the North Sea, and that's where you get stronger waves, and so it's much more of a risk. But all the weather patterns are going to change, so there are no guarantees. It's quite possible you live in a part of the world where you're thinking a 3-metre storm surge, is that all? Hurricane Katrina, 8-metre storm surge. Hurricane Sandy, 4 metres in New York City. The reasons they're having to make the coastal defences so substantial isn't just because they've got to stop a 1 metre increase in sea level, but because of the impacts of storm surges, of the storms in Europe, which at one time only happened once every 100 years, but in the future could be happening every 10 years or possibly every year. Walls are still being built on the sides of Portsmouth that don't face onto the open sea and won't take the full force of storms. And in fact, in places where walls would block views, even glass panels are used to hold back the sea. Well, remember, in the 2015 Paris Agreement, loss and damage is mentioned, and that covers all the areas, all the risks that you know are going to happen, but you can't do anything about. So every country in the world, or just about every country in the world, is putting in place measures to cope with extreme weather events that they can't protect you from. They might not tell you this, but they will be assessing the risks that your part of the world might be at risk from, like storm surges. They'll work out ways to monitor it. So in Britain, in recent years, with powerful computers, the weather forecasting has become much better. Then they'll have a way to notify you if you're watching the video, possibly through your mobile phone. Some African villages have invested in loud hailers, so they can contact all the villages very quickly. And then they will have a plan in place to try and to cope with the disaster, to move people, to rescue people, whatever needs to be done. They might not have told you that, but these things are going into place. This is a proper defensive wall, isn't it? Steps there to raise you up, stop the floods. Another wall, there's 2 walls there effectively, isn't there? Plus the height of the sand. See, superficially you might come along and think, oh, well, this doesn't look too bad. The whole thing about the video is, what is the first city in Britain or anywhere that's going to be lost to rising sea levels? Well, it's going to be somewhere in Bangladesh. But if it's not in Bangladesh, where might it be then? Could it be Portsmouth? It could be. London is in a very similar predicament. Has an equally high population density, same elevation, same impacts of sea level rise. At least with Portsmouth, its circumference is 12 miles. It's 180 million pounds for 2 miles. I'm afraid I got my maths a bit mixed up at this point. Portsmouth is having 4.5 kilometres of coastal defences upgraded. That's about 2.8 miles. for a total cost of £180 million, and that works out at £40 million for each kilometre. London would need to have 330 kilometres of coastal defences built up along the Thames estuary to protect it. Well, £40 million a kilometre, that would be £13.2 billion. Plus, it's got these 7 barriers that need to be built, including a new version of the Thames barrier. The Thames barrier took 8 years to build, and in today's money costs about £2.4 billion. So, to protect London will take a lot of money. There are plans, like with Portsmouth. London has a plan as well. At the moment, they're just monitoring what goes on. They won't start acting seriously until 2050, and it's thought by 2070 the Thames barrier will need to be replaced. And in fact, there's something like 9 barriers they're going to have to build. What's interesting is, at the moment, it's 2025. People are sort of warming up to the impacts of climate change. There's no big tipping points yet in public opinion. By 2050, if that's when London starts to take its Thames barrier seriously and its flood defences seriously, by 2050 it's quite possible we'll have a much better idea. By that time, 1 in 4 homes in Britain will be at risk of flooding. It's quite possible then they will decide what to do. It will be much clearer to everyone how much sea level rise we can expect and how practical it is to still protect London. Another place that's at very risk of flooding in Britain is Hull. It's already had 8,000 homes flooded. Lasted several days. Because it wasn't in London or the south of England, nobody seemed to mind too much. It's on the north coast, where they have, in the North Sea, where they have these great storms. Will people take it seriously? There are people in Britain who live in houses that are regularly flooded. One couple I saw, their house has been flooded 7 times in the last 20 years. It's by a river. And when your house has been flooded, if they think there's a risk it might be flooded again in the future, the insurance company will pay up, because the government will still make sure the economy works, and insurance companies will cover people. When they restore your house after a flood, they give you solid stone floors, which easily wipe down after a flood. They put your electric sockets higher up. They give you all sorts of other things like that. So adaptation doesn't mean protecting everyone, which is impossible. 1 in 4 houses at risk of flooding. But just getting used to a world where now and again, through extreme weather events, people do get flooded. But how is this going to play out into the future? Well, in Britain, we have these digital maps, which probably Google's got something to do with. We have these digital maps. They can tell to great accuracy which houses in which towns are at risk of flooding, and they will contact the individual householders and help them to get their houses ready to protect against flooding. At the moment, though, there's good confidence between the people and the government. The insurance companies cover people. Sooner or later, though, that will reach a tipping point, and the government won't be able to help everyone. You know, Portsmouth, 210,000 people packed together, that's financially viable. If you live in East Anglia, which is very low, much lower population density, maybe the government won't be able to help you. Maybe the insurance companies will no longer be pressured by the government into paying out or to covering people from flood risk. So we reached a tipping point, won't we, where people are happy to move into Portsmouth. There are still big housing developments going on. The city council still identifies new land where people can build houses. Sooner or later, though, that time will come when it's obvious Portsmouth doesn't have a future. There will come a time when you have to retreat from the sea in Portsmouth, and this begs the question, if they decided to retreat now, that'd be 10,000 homes, 20 to 30,000 people possibly. If you build up, and that way the population of Portsmouth would naturally adapt to the new climate. This way, though, by protecting everyone in Portsmouth, the government will be keeping the population levels high. And so one day, when it does come that it's no longer viable to live in Portsmouth, it's quite possible you'll just have to abandon the whole city. What does this all mean for Portsmouth? It's quite possible that the new defences will keep it safe for 100 years. even allowing for the storm surges. By the year 2050 or 2060, it will be more obvious if we're on the 1 or 2 metre trajectory. We're currently on this orange line that gets to just over 4 metres of sea level rise by the year 2300. Let's be positive, say we're on that trajectory, and let's say Portsmouth is safe for another 100 years, or 4 metres in 300 years' time. It does sound quite high. So if we say Portsmouth can cope with 1 metre of sea level rise, possibly 2, but not 4. So somewhere between 2 and 3 metres of sea level rise it can cope with, providing it can cope with the storms. So let's say our best estimate by someone who's not a climate scientist, can Portsmouth last another 200 years, do you think? Will that be the limit? Maybe. That's the best possible case. If the sea levels continue to rise more quickly than was expected, as they did last year, maybe it will be between 100 years and 200 years. Does that sound fair? Maybe it'll be sooner. Still, we should never know. It'll be for someone else to worry about. That's the end of the video, really. It hasn't ended in a great spectacular way this week. All we found out is sea level rise will inevitably destroy cities in low-lying coastal areas. We just don't know when, which is really what we knew at the very beginning of the video. Anyway, thank you for watching, and well done for sticking right to the very end of the video.